My name is Teresa, and I work as a 911 dispatcher here in Michigan for 8 long years. The job has its perks. The pay was pretty good, because $22 an hour was nothing to sniff at for someone like me, someone with absolutely nothing in the way of college prospects. It turned out that all I needed to apply was my high school diploma, a willingness to knuckle down and soak up the on-the-job training, and the will to listen to some of the most haunting, terrifying things that anyone could possibly hear. The first 2 came relatively easy, the last one not so much. But after a while, the mix of mundane, my neighbor's dog barked at me kind of nonsense, and the adrenaline-soaked, lives on the line kind of calls made for a weird dichotomy. I mean, you never really wanted to hear that someone's home was being broken into by a man with a fire axe, intent on murdering them. True story, by the way. Or that someone's kid had been electrocuted by sticking a fork into an electrical socket. Also a true story. But whenever someone called up in a panic and you geared up to save lives only to find out that they had seen some teenager graffiti an alley somewhere, you just wanted to find that person and slap them before making them eat their cell phone. Just over 50% of all the calls were something we could actually act upon. A medical emergency, a fire, some actual violent crime or something. The other 40% were just non-events. People of diminished capacity, or Karens as I suppose you call them these days, who'd never really contemplated just exactly what was their business and what wasn't. But the other 10%, maybe even less than that, were things that would keep me up at night if I didn't self-medicate with my preferred cocktail of double V's, 3 double vodkas, and 2 Valium. I honestly don't want to talk about most of those calls, the ones that made horror movies more like comedies, but there is one I keep in reserve for whenever I get that "what was your worst call ever" question from the mentally deficient or morbidly curious, and this is how it went. So I get a call popping up on my screen one cloudy Saturday afternoon. I answer it with the same old 911, what is your emergency, line that sometimes I thought would end up getting chiseled into my gravestone. Only I don't hear a thing on the other end of the line. Now, we get way more accidental calls than you might expect. Even before they brought out smartphones, they had those newfangled emergency tap features. We used to get a fair amount of accidental 911 calls just from what is sophisticatedly known as butt dialing. These are irritating at the best of times, not just because they take up much-needed line space, but because sometimes people call 911 when they're in an emergency in which they're unable to speak. So naturally, when we get these kinds of calls, we either have to call back to ensure an emergency isn't in process, or take the time to trace the call before sending out an officer or 2 to confirm that everything is fine. But anyway, there I am, parroting "hello" down the line, before letting out a sigh when I start to suspect that this is yet another butt-dialing event that is going to take up valuable time. Yet just as I'm about to hang up to initiate a callback and a possible trace, I hear this tiny little voice on the other end of the line. I couldn't quite tell if it was a little boy or a little girl, but they were young, really young, no older than about 4 or 5 years old. "Hello?" they asked, in the cutest little voice I'd ever heard in all my time manning that desk. But they were scared. Really scared, not quite crying, but that kind of confused fear that you only hear in kids that small. "Hello, sweetie, I'm here," I said, instantly changing my matter-of-fact tone into one that was much more nurturing and friendly. "Is everything okay?" "I need a 911, they replied. "Well, you did a great calling 911, sweetie. Good job. Are Mommy or Daddy there? Can you give them the phone for me?" "Daddy isn't here, but Mommy is." "Okay, sweetie, can you be a really good kid and put Mommy on the phone for me?" I asked, remaining as patient and calm as I possibly could. There was every chance this was just some kid being silly, but something in their little voice made me think otherwise, and I was right. What they said next is something I heard over and over again for months after. "Mommy's eye fell out." I paused, hoping I misheard her, praying I'd misheard her. "What was that, sweetie? Mommy's eye fell out?" "Yeah, it's fell out and she won't get up," she repeated. I slowly pieced together a mental image of what she was seeing in my head. When it came together, I felt sick, like physically nauseous. I was pretty sure I was listening to a child being traumatized in real time. Yes, I've had worse calls, more violent calls where I've literally listened to a person lose their life on the line. But for some reason, hearing that kid describe what I imagined to be her dead or dying mother, hearing that kid's innocence being burned away by whatever horrendous image she was seeing, that was all so much worse. "Sweetie, do you know where it is you live at?" I remember asking the kid. There was a slim chance they knew a street name or a neighborhood, but I commenced a call trace all the same. We needed the cops out there double time to get her away from whatever she was seeing. "Yeah," she replied. "I live at home." With being a home phone, the trace took seconds, and I kept them on the line while I directed the nearest active unit of cops onto her location. "Sweetie, do you know what happened to Mommy?" I asked her. My number one concern at the time was that someone had actually attacked their mom, and whoever that was might still be in or around the home with the potential to hurt the kid. "Mommy and Daddy were shouting," they replied. Okay. I need you to not look at Mommy anymore. Can you do that for me, sweetie?" "Yeah." "I want you to turn away from Mommy and look at something else. Do you have a stuffy or anything else that you'd like to look at?" "I have Olaf," she replied, which I later learned was the snowman character from the movie Frozen. "Okay, I want you to stay on the phone with me and look at Olaf." I tried everything I could to keep them from looking at her mom, asking them to describe Olaf to me in as much detail as possible, and asking question after question just to keep their little mind occupied. I kept talking until I heard the cops were on the scene. They had no problem getting into the apartment in question because apparently the door was left wide open. The kid, who turned out to be a little girl of just 4 years old, was taken to child services, where she is now on the verge of entering the adoption system. Hopefully she'll find a family that will care for her and give her the happy, stable life that she so richly deserves. It turned out that the girl's father was never around, and that the man that had beaten her mother to death with a claw hammer was actually the woman's current boyfriend, who had a history of drug use and violence against women. After he had attacked and murdered her, apparently over a seemingly minor issue, he tried to flee out of the state in a misguided attempt to evade justice. But thanks to a busted taillight, he was pulled over in a routine traffic stop and acted too skittish that the traffic cop ended up detaining him while he searched his car. Apparently the cop found the bloody claw hammer in the trunk of his car and arrested him there and then. Like I said before, this isn't the worst call I'd ever received during my time in the job. There are some that still give me nightmares years later, but this is the worst one that I'm still comfortable talking about. Maybe just because it has a semblance of a happy ending, given that the little girl in question ended up getting adopted by a loving couple who just so happened to be looking to give a home to a kid, just like her. Back when I worked full-time for the fire department, I used to take the odd shift working the medical side of the 911 dispatch center. Since smartphones have been getting more and more sophisticated, I've heard it's much easier to pin down exact locations. And in the UK, they have this new 3-word system that brings EMTs right on top of your position, should you happen to be stranded somewhere with no recognizable landmarks. I'm almost certain a system such as this is about to be implemented in certain states, but back in 2006, when all anyone had was flip phones and whatnot, finding out exactly where an injured party was could prove extremely difficult. From what I understand, these days you can ping a location to within a few feet of where a call is coming from, but back in the early 2000s, the area was ballooned to square miles. South side or north side of a city, maybe a county, but nothing as accurate as the tech today. So, with that little bit of context established, this is by far the worst 911 call I ever received. I got a call from a cell phone, presumably one of the aforementioned flip phones, and it was a younger girl telling me her mom had fallen and wouldn't wake up. Over the course of several questions, I established that not only has the mom apparently fallen down a flight of uncushioned wooden stairs, but that she didn't seem to have any vital signs whatsoever. This could have simply been because her young daughter simply didn't know what she was looking for or had made a mistake when it came to her breathing or her pulse. But the really alarming thing, the little girl couldn't give us an exact address, and as much as I asked her things like, "Do you have any mail around to read the address off of?" nothing seemed to work. She couldn't find anything, she couldn't remember, and she was beginning to panic. And in a situation where every single second counts, we were burning valuable time. What's worse, all she could say about where she lived was that it's a farm. And given that pretty much all of my district was rural farmlands, her description didn't bring us any closer to saving her mom's life. Working through all the standard questioning, I got to asking how long it had been since her mom fell down the stairs. She told me her mom had fallen just after her favorite TV show had started, and doing the math, I figured out that she'd been down for 30 minutes at the very least. We're taught to remain completely professional in those situations. I mean, I had one regional dispatch trainer tell me, the more robotic you are, the better. The more detached you are, the more lives you'll save. But in that moment, hearing the mom had been out for like a half hour, I felt my heart sinking. It was like an ice block in my chest. It was the toughest time I've ever had trying to keep it together on a call. But as per my training, I just took a deep breath and tried to mechanically work through the problem-solving techniques I'd been taught. I'd asked her the street name, if there were any landmarks, if there was mail in the house, what she could see out of her front door, but the only thing that landed was the landmarks thing, with the girl telling me that her family walked to and from church every Sunday. Walked. So it had to be close, right? Seconds later, my supervisor and law enforcement are scouring a map of our assigned area, marking off every single church within a few miles of working farms. When they'd narrowed it down to a total number of 5 churches that could feasibly be walking distance for a family with small children, we dispatched a unit to each one with specific instructions to go in lights and sirens the whole way. This would give our younger caller a shot at hearing them approaching so we could further coordinate our response. But just keeping in mind that with only 3 fire rescue vehicles, 2 ambulances, and 4 police patrol cars to cover the entire area, tracking down this young girl's location meant we'd be stretching thin the entire time. By trying to save one life, we'd be risking the lives of others. It was a nerve-wracking risk, but one we were willing to take. Thankfully, after hearing some of our frantic calls going out over the radios, a couple of sheriff's deputies and a handful of highway patrol officers volunteered themselves to join the search effort. Bearing in mind that all this had happened, and we were no more than about 15 minutes into the call. I've never seen or heard of such a large-scale response in our county. Not on my watch, anyway. I mean, we really did go into overdrive as soon as all the circumstances of the call became evident. I remember the 15-minute mark because this is about the time we learned that the phone she was using was a cordless one, and the family kept the phone at the bottom of the stairs, just feet away from the front door. This obviously meant that she'd be able to walk outside to look for lights and listen for sirens, a major breakthrough in our efforts to locate her. There was some added suspense when it seemed like she might not have been able to open the front door, but I thanked God when I heard her say, "I got it." Then, it was just a matter of waiting and hoping she'd heard the sirens in time. I know it's a huge cliche to say that minutes seem like hours or whatever, but I'd never really understood that whole time is elastic concept until then. It really did seem like forever before she heard our sirens, but there was no time to celebrate when she did. We were still faced with the task of figuring out which of our emergency vehicles we could hear. Law enforcement thought fast and had me telling each responder to stop and turn off their sirens before one by one we had them turn them back on so we could determine which one was the closest to her. It turned out to be one of the fire rigs, so we sent everybody to their position and then they spread out to cover the general area, all with their sirens on again. Eventually, one of the state troopers pulled into her street and the girl could see him coming. When the rest of the dispatch center heard me saying, "Okay, run to the fire truck, honey. Go wave to the fire truck," there was a bunch of silent celebration as people punched the air or buried their heads in their hands in relief. As the little girl met the fire truck, the driver was able to relay his position to us, and they signaled that her job was essentially done. I stayed on the line while EMTs were guided onto the property, and once they'd arrived, it was adios from us, and all we could do was hope that the mom was okay. Well, it was more like pray by that point, as for all we knew, she had been flatlined for just going on about an hour. However, we heard later that by the time the medical guys got there, the mom was actually awake. She was incredibly disoriented as there was clearly something horribly wrong with her, but she was alive at least. They later found out that she had a broken back, an absolutely horrific break too, and one that might take her more than a year to recover from. The young girl was given a little reward from the police department for her bravery in the call, as she kept calm and did everything we told her to do. I can't say it was anything more than a token, something to take the edge off the traumatic event she'd gone through, but what else can you do? I suppose this has something of a happy ending, though. The mother recovered with no brain or nerve damage, but the recovery process in itself sounded almost as bad as the injury. I suppose the reason I'm telling you all this is to serve a reminder for something very, very important. As someone who's worked as an emergency dispatcher, I really can't stress how important it is for parents to teach their kids the following things. 1. Teach them your first and last names. 2. Get them to learn their home phone number off by heart. 3. Teach them how to make a 911 call, and that's all attached to that. 4. Teach them their home address and zip code. This is by far the most important one. I've lost count of the number of times when this information would have literally saved a life, or at least prevented life-changing damage to health or property. So please, you're not just sparing some 911 dispatchers' nerves, you might have been saving your own life, or those of your family members. Turn it into a game somehow. Heck, get creative, turn it into a song. But please, teach your kids their home address and teach them how to ask for police, ambulance, or fire.
It's kind of a running joke in my office that I always get the weirdest calls, and it's true. One of the more interesting ones I got was from a drunk guy who meant to call the cops and was trying to file a noise complaint about his own party. While some of my calls can be pretty strange, they're usually fairly tame. I've been pretty lucky, because I haven't had too many disturbing or sad stories to tell from my years working as a 911 operator. If you're looking for something like that, I can point you to several of my colleagues, because, unfortunately, there's no shortage of those in this industry. The call that particularly sticks in my mind is one that I had about a year or two ago. I can honestly say it's one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I think it's going to stick with me forever. It had actually been a fairly slow afternoon that day. I know it sounds kind of insensitive, but if you're not taking a call, this job can get pretty boring. I got stuck covering my friend's evening shift, and I didn't expect things to get more interesting. I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended, when a call came through my line. I put my headset on and ran through the usual script. 911, what's your emergency? I think there's someone in my house. The voice sounded like it belonged to a young child. My heart sank. Calls from children were always the worst. We're trained to get as much information from each caller as possible. This makes it easier to more fully understand the situation, as well as figure out which emergency service to dispatch. What's your name, sweetie? I keep my voice calm and upbeat. There was no need in scaring them any further than they undoubtedly already were. Elizabeth, she said softly. I think she might have been crying. That's a beautiful name. Even though I didn't show it, I was beginning to get nervous. This is very important. Can you tell me what's happening right now? The line was quiet for a moment, But then Elizabeth started talking. I think someone's in my house. Where are your parents? I ask. They're not home. I'm not sure where they are. I was pretty angry when I heard this. What kind of parents leave a little girl home alone this late at night? Is there anybody else there with you? Yeah, I think they're looking for me, Elizabeth began, but her voice abruptly stopped at the very end of her sentence. Had it not been for her quiet, frightened breaths, I would have thought she, or whoever else was there, hung up. They said my name. She was definitely crying now. Where are you right now? I heard a door close. In my parents' closet. She spoke a little louder now, probably thinking that the intruder wouldn't be able to hear her from in there. I hoped she was right. I was glad that she knew to hide. A lot of kids freeze up in dangerous situations like this, especially if their parents or an older sibling aren't there. I asked her for her address, which she gave to me, but for the sake of privacy, I'll only say that Elizabeth's house was in a fairly nice neighborhood in my area, and it wasn't far from the police station, which was very helpful. Elizabeth, just focus on my voice. I need you to try and relax. I'm sending the police to your house right now, and they should be there in about 5 minutes. Can you hold on until then? Even though I would usually try to get a little more information about the intruder, I always tend to err on the side of caution when children call 911. I'd much rather send someone and have it be a false alarm than risk their safety. Elizabeth didn't answer my question, and it took her longer than I was comfortable with for her to respond. When she did, it was only one word. Listen. I heard the phone crackle as she brought it away from her ear and held it out in front of her. At first, I didn't hear anything, but as I focused on the background noise, I noticed a lot of whispering. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but it definitely sounded like it was coming from more than one person. I hoped the police would get there on time. As much as I help people with my job, and as many lives as I've saved, it's always so frustrating that I can't do anything myself other than wait and talk. Elizabeth's voice came out in hushed sobs. He's coming up here. Please help. The police are almost there. I need you to be quiet so he doesn't hear you. You're gonna be okay, sweetie, I promise. She seemed to calm down a bit. Everything was quiet for a moment, save for the whispering, which was much louder now. I still didn't know what they were saying, but I was sure it was coming from multiple people. I could pick out at least 3 distinct voices. When I heard a door creak open through the phone, my heart leapt. Elizabeth screamed, and I knew that the intruders had found her. I was so scared for her, and I desperately hoped that someone would be there to help soon. Are you okay? I need you to tell me what's going on. I was trying and failing to stop my voice from cracking. I couldn't let her know that I was afraid. There's a man, Elizabeth whispered. He has really long legs and a really big smile. My imagination was running away with me. I pictured this poor girl, alone in the closet, as an impossibly tall man towered over her. I heard another bang coming from somewhere in the house, and someone yelling, "Police!" Thank God. I could hear Elizabeth crying as the whispers intensified. I still didn't understand how she only saw one person. There had to have been more than 4. He isn't touching the floor. The line cut off. I frantically tried to re-establish the connection, but no matter how many times I tried, I was met with only silence on the other end. I would like to close with a message to any parent hearing this. Please, please don't leave your young children home by themselves. I haven't heard anything about Elizabeth or her family in the year since this happened. The police only found the phone.